Why race-based reparations for slavery are unfair and unworkable. Welcome to another episode of Spin Cycle America, where I talk about what is happening in the world today. Nothing but facts. I hit both sides of the aisle. I'm your host, Todd. Today and all this week, we are going to talk about reparations. Fair or not, let's get started. Today we're tackling one of the most decisive or divisive issues in America: reparations for slavery. Some prominent voices, including black leaders and politicians in high positions, are demanding cash payments for major wealth transfers of black Americans as compensation for horrors of slavery. It's an emotional topic, don't get me wrong. Slavery was brutal, evil, and, and a stain on our history. No one seriously denies that. This is bad. This is something that should never happen. But does it make sense to force reparations today paid by current taxpayers to specific racial groups? So think about that question seriously. I don't care what your race, nationality, religious group is, what you're thinking. You need to think about this, and you need to open your history books for a change, and you need to actually do some research on this because this is a serious topic. So let's cut through the noise with facts, history, and logic. My position is clear. Race-based reparation is unfair and impractical and sets a dangerous precedent. The blood already spilled in the Civil War, combined with massive post-slavery immigration, makes collective racial guilt payments unworkable. Stick around, and I'm going to explain why. So let's acknowledge about the past. Okay, first, let's be clear. American chattel hit slavery was horrific. Enslaved African endured unimaginable suffering, family separations, and denial of basic human rights. It contradicted the founding ideas of liberty. That is true. That you cannot deny. I'm not denying. The transatlantic slave trade brought millions of Americans, millions of slaves to America. The U.S. had about 4 million enslaved people by the 1860s. It was wrong then, and it is condemned now. But we can even go back further than that. The starting point was actually in 1619, was the first recorded arrival of enslaved Africans, about 20 people. In the it was established in the English colonies of Virginia at Point Comfort. This was the beginning of the chattel slavery in the British colonies that would eventually become the United States. So you can go way back then. All right. So I'm not denying anything about it. Today, some leaders push bills like H.R. 40 to study reparations. Polls show that about 77% black Americans support some form of repayment to descendants of the enslaved, while around only 18% of white Americans do. That's a huge divide. Now let's talk about this a minute, and I'm going to explain why this is really wrong. Okay, because there's nobody's looking into the future or what actually happened and how this came about. I mean, we're talking about not only the blacks suffered during that time frame, during the Civil War, there's a lot of people that died during that time frame. And so I'm going to point out some things that maybe some other people deserve reparations if we're going to throw out cash. But emotions isn't enough for policy. We need to ask who actually owes what to whom, and why should people alive today pay for the sins they didn't commit? This becomes a serious question that will need to be answered along the way, but it needs to be looked at and answered. Should money really be paid out? So, the immigration reality, let's talk about that for a minute. So, here's some key facts many reparations advocates downplay. Most white Americans today have ancestors who arrived after slavery ended. So think about that a minute. Most white Americans today have ancestries that arrived after slavery ended. I'll say that again. Most white Americans have slavery, or I mean, today have ancestries who arrived after slavery ended. So if this is a fact, then why or who should pay? Many African Americans who arrived in America after slavery ended as well. So think about that. Many African Americans who arrived in the United States after slavery as well. Think about that. So do they or should they get reparations as well? When does this end? When will it ever end? This will come up a little bit here in a little bit as well. Slavery officially ended in 1865 with the 13th Amendment. Massive immigration waves followed between 1870 and 1900. Nearly 12 million immigrants came mostly from Europe. Another huge wave from 1890 to 1919 brought over 18 million more, many from Southern and Eastern Europe, Italians, Poles, Russians, Germans, Irish. Think about that. So, by some estimates, only about 40 to 60% of today's white Americans have deep colonial stock, ancestries going back to and before the Civil War. Millions of white families trace their U.S. roots to the late 19th and 20th century. Their ancestors were plowing fields in Europe or escaping famine or persecution when slavery existed here. They had zero involvement here. Think about that, people. And you want them to pay reparations for something they weren't even involved with. I kept saying that before. And it's not just whites today. Taxpayers include millions of Asians, Hispanics, and recent African immigrants whose families had nothing to do with American slavery. Why should a Vietnamese refugee who arrived in the late 1880s or 1980s, who their kids pay reparation for something that ended over a century before they got here? Why should they have to pay? We're talking this money would be coming out of our taxes, their taxes. Why should they have to pay? Or what about those who are mixed, half white, half black? Do they or should they get reparations as well? Or should they have to pay reparations? The white side pay reparations, the black side receive it? You tell me. People are just throwing this out just because of the color of their skin. You either owe money or you receive money, but yet have not checked history. They have not done the research. They have not looked into it. They're just throwing it out because of the color of their skin. I'm black, I should receive reparations. You're white, you owe me money. That is not how this works. This isn't about denying history. It's about individual responsibility. You can't hold millions of unrelated people collectively guilty based on the color of their skin. That's the opposite of justice. So let's talk about the Civil War blood. So this is where I was mentioning a few minutes ago about other people besides African Americans who possibly should receive reparations. So if we're talking generalization, debts, and sacrifices, let's talk about the Civil War, the bloodiest conflict in American history. Roughly between 620,000 to 750,000 Americans died. Union forces around 360,000 soldiers, many from disease, but also in brutal combat. Union soldiers which ultimately ended slavery through the Emancipation Proclamation and victory included hundreds of thousands of white soldiers who gave their lives. Also, about 180,000 black soldiers also served in the Union Army and suffered heavy casualties. But the overwhelming majority of the fighting and dying on the Union side was was the white Americans whose descendants are told today they will still owe debt. So should we not pay them for their sacrifice? Their families lost fathers, sons, brothers, farms were destroyed, widows left behind. The war tore the country apart to preserve the Union and ultimately end slavery. So if descendants of slaves deserve payment for historical wrongs, shouldn't descendants of those Union soldiers who died to free the slaves also have a claim? Think about that for a minute. The logic collapses quickly into absurdity. It pits Americans against Americans based on race, ignoring the shared sacrifice that already paid a terrible price. So now, where should we stand? Where do we stand? Who is in the right? Do reparations really have a place in today's society? Practical nightmare is and better. So even if we ignore fairness and practical problems are massive, who qualifies? Prove direct descendant from U.S. slaves. Who? What about the mixed ancestors? I mentioned that earlier. Recent African immigrants. Now, 9% of the black population, Caribbean descendants. What about them? Who pays? Who pays? Current taxpayers? Many unrelated, including poor white, Asian, Hispanics, estimate estimates for total reparations run into the trillions and even tens of trillions of dollars. Precedent: Native Americans claims, Irish indentured servants, Italians, Asian discrimination, Jewish Americans. Where will it end? At the rate we're going, this will never end. This turns America into a never-ending grievance competition instead of a nation of individuals. Better approach is to focus on universal policies that help people regardless of their race. School choice is an is a great option uh, to improve education, criminal justice reform, political strength, strengthening families. Two two-parent households are one of the strongest predictors of success today. Economic growth lifts all boats. Data shows massive black middle class growth since the Civil War era. Even if gaps remain, culture, family education, and personal choice matters more than 160-year-old history for most uh, over outcomes now. So think about that. So in closing, slavery was profound and wrong. America has made real progress through abolition, Reconstruction, civil rights, and opportunity. True justice means equal rule under the law, not racial wealth redistribution. It means judging people as individuals, not avatars of their ancestors, sin or suffering. Forcing reparations divides us further and distracts from real solutions. So, what do you think? Should we pay reparations based on race? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Civil discussion only. If you found this helpful, like and subscribe below. Hit the bell. Share with someone who needs to hear this. Hear these facts over feelings. Thank you for watching. See you next time on Spin Cycle America. You all have an outstanding